Welcome to Future Knowledge, a podcast about knowledge, creativity, and policy, brought to you by the Internet Archive and Authors Alliance. Artificial intelligence is rapidly transforming global power dynamics, and copyright law is emerging as a critical factor in that competition. As the U.S. races to maintain its leadership in AI development, legal battles over data and intellectual property could shape not only the future of AI, but also America's influence on the world stage. How can we balance the demands of innovation and copyright, and what's at stake if we get it wrong? Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Freeland, and I'm a librarian at the Internet Archive. I want to welcome you to today's book talk. As we get started here, I want to introduce Wan Zhao. Wan Zhao is the staff attorney at Authors Alliance. They are a co-host for these book talks, and she will be facilitating today's conversation.
Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. For today's book talk, we'll explore the rapidly evolving relationship between copyright law, artificial intelligence, and global competition. To help us unpack these complex ideas, we have the two authors of Copyright AI and Great Power Competition with us today. They are from the FAI, the Foundation for American Innovation. First, we have Josh Levine. Josh is a research fellow at FAI. His work focuses on policies that foster digital competition and interoperability in digital markets. We also have Tim Wang with us today. Tim is general counsel and a senior fellow at FAI, focused on the intersection of artificial intelligence and intellectual property. And to moderate today's talk, we have the Internet Archive Senior Policy Counsel, Leela Bailey.
Hello, everyone. I am so thrilled to have Tim and Josh here to talk about an issue that is always swirling up interesting feelings and ideas in our community. So I'm just going to immediately hand it over to Tim and Josh, and they're going to give us a bit of an introduction to their paper and the topics of fair use and competition.
Thanks, Leila, and thanks, Yanzhao. So let me just start with kind of an introduction for how this paper even came to be and why it exists. My background on all this is that I'm a longstanding IP and tech nerd, if you will. I was radicalized by, Lessig's free culture and code in the early 2000s. I'm a former EFF intern and a former Creative Commons intern. I never interned through the archive, but of course, a longtime admirer. And I think what brought me to a lot of those issues, in the 2000s was really this idea that technology, and one of the great things about technology was that it was gonna democratize, right? That if we could only get sort of intellectual property right, we would really be able to benefit from everybody being able to express themselves creatively. And at the time, we were talking about, I don't know, like you should be able to Photoshop a Disney image and or a video and put it up on YouTube. And so it's very funny is like back then, a lot of the debates we were having were these kind of very interesting debates, but ultimately tied up in kind of domestic creative industry and also kind of free expression of artists. And that was really the kind of ferment on which kind of I got involved in sort of the IP and tech debates. But, I think one of the reasons why the topic is still interesting to me, after all these years, is really that copyright it's in everything. It's like impossible to escape because it literally is intellectual property, right? Which is just like arguably embedded in everything that you touch. And so this paper, I think, is one of the first, if I can kind of pat myself in Josh's backs figuratively, I think to kind of like just point out this very weird world that we're living in, right? Which is that the debates about copyright that we're having in the mid 2000s, right? About, is it possible to Photoshop Mickey into your fan fiction comic? And what are the rights you have over that? Those very same debates are now like defining like global technological competition with arguably one of the most impactful technologies that we're going to see over the next few decades. And that is artificial intelligence. And so it's just the kind of like one initial goal of the paper is just to kind of make that link that this incredibly nerdy, wonky sort of like, thing that very much is tied up in what you might think of as like artistic expression has these kind of like rules and laws and decision makings and norms that are going to end up shaping things geopolitically. And that's the argument of the paper is if you buy our argument, there is this very deep link. And we should really think about seriously about the degree to which sort of IP influences that, these kind of broader global discussions. And the way the reverse should take place, right? Like the degree to which these kind of geopolitical concerns should or should not impact how we make these decisions domestically. And I think that's kind of the fun sort of place where reasonable minds can differ. And one of the places where I love debating and thinking about this topic. Let me talk first a little bit about like why copyright and AI are even related. A lot of this comes down to the fact that there's a lot of mumbo jumbo around AI, but the really basic thing is that it's like statistics. Like effectively, all you're doing is you're taking a bunch of data, and what AI is attempting to do is sort of model that data in a statistical sense. So you might hear phrases like token prediction thrown around. And that pertains to these kind of large language models that are at the core of things like ChatGPT and Llama and all these other sort of AI models that have come out. And all it's really doing is to basically say, from all the text that this kind of mathematical model has seen before, can it imitate that text? Can it generate text which is very similar in nature? And what's interesting is that in order to get these AI systems to learn, the background has been that an immense amount of data has been needed, unlike the way sort of my 1-year-old learns. This is not a matter of you show the AI or the computer a few examples and it's able to reproduce it. The forging of these models has almost literally implied downloading large sections of the internet to try to train these models to do what they can do. And the results have been remarkable, right, in the AI space. Like the kinds of things that computers can do now are just like very fun and interesting. And I guess it's almost kind of amazing that we're sort of like not a year or two on, but we're like, oh yeah, we can just have natural language conversations with our AI. Or you might have seen this very funny thing where it turns out that the ChatGPT gets lazy during the holidays, right? Because it learned all these habits from all the data that it's been fed. And that kind of workflow, right? This relationship between the data that you need to create these AI systems that can do all these kind of very interesting, amazing things is ultimately where copyright gets in, right? Because those works are, they might be in the public domain, they might be owned by people, they might be in a weird gray area. But the sort of immensity of the data necessary has kind of created this sort of interesting tension in the space. And the question is basically whether or not the training of these AI systems should be considered what is known as a fair use under copyright doctrine. So the default rule under copyright is very strict. It's almost like if I literally scrawl a drawing on a piece of paper, I kind of have all rights reserved over it. And effectively what fair use says is, look, in certain cases, we actually don't want people to have the right to shut down every single use of that sort of creative work. And so you can think about here, the right for journalists to be able to kind of, and artists for them to be able to critique other people's work. That's a classic sort of fair use doctrine that says basically, even though you created it, these uses are okay, and you don't need to get that person's original author's kind of permission to use that work. And so the question is, okay, well, if all this data is going into AI, like, is it a fair use to do that training, but to create these systems in the first place? Is that something that requires permission from all? Or is it something where we say for public interest, for public reasons, innovation potentially being one of them, we want to allow sort of these models to get trained? And that's the state of play, right? We're actually in this really interesting legal ambiguity right now. And there's these kind of lawsuits that are happening all across the country to litigate the details of how this doctrine will play out. And I think if that were it alone, it would already be an interesting issue, right? You have this incredible move and explosion of like technological advancement that kind of rests on a certain assumption about the way IP works and the idea that this is actually, in fact, a fair use. And I think what I'll do now is I'll turn it a little bit over to Josh, because it turns out that, of course, AI has not just been a domestic phenomenon. It's not just like a technology that we've been using, but like many other critical technologies, right? It's getting increasingly kind of sucked into the world of geopolitics and kind of the geopolitical tensions that we have now, not just sort of between sort of the US and China, but also just around the world in general. And so the degree to which we think that kind of global competition is around not just like power in the strictest sense, but really around sort of tech. What has happened is, again, this kind of very funny thing where these sort of debates in the 2000s about can I Photoshop Mickey Mouse, are now coming to define like a whole generation of global competition as well. And so what I want to do is give Josh maybe a few minutes here just to give a sketch of how that international scene looks and really what we mean when we say great power competition.
Thanks, Tim. So to set the scene a little bit on the geopolitical side of things, if you read the news, if you look at what's happening in governments, both in our own government and around the world, artificial intelligence is being staked out as potentially defining technology for the 21st century, particularly as it comes to both economic implications, but also strategic and military ones. AI can be used, obviously, as a chatbot, as a companion to work on creative work or to help you learn a new skill, but can also be the backbone or the underpinning for computer vision models, which can be used in a whole host of intelligence and military applications. They can be used to help develop new medicines and new biological chemicals and things of that nature. And so that makes AI, the development of AI, it doesn't matter just for our own communities here at home, but it matters all around the world. And being a leader in those technologies will have significant implications for America's global standing vis-a-vis China, who's been risen as our peer adversary in a lot of these fights, but also in the EU and our allies, friends, and frankly, everyone in the world is getting impacted by many of these technologies. And in China specifically, this is kind of part of the reason why Tim and I wrote this paper, was to outline the legislative, legal, and kind of regulatory changes they were doing and we were seeing there in response to the growing demand for data to train these AI models. In 2013, there's a specific law put out by the CAC, which is the Cybersecurity Administration of China, who manages lots of the laws and rules around the development of technology that relate to national security. And this allowed for any company in China who is training an AI model or is looking to access data to train a model, they do not have to abide by IP rights. They are able to access data specifically if they're going to be working in industry, in parlance with the government, to do research, or to provide certain services to people outside of mainland China. The great example of this would be DeepSeek, which is an open source LLM AI model that's multimodal as well. So that means it can do pictures, it can do sound, it can do text. And this piece of software was trained on a large corpus of data that was found both within China, but also outside of it. Most specifically, you can look at Anna's Archive, which is a hosting website for lots of different types of data, some of which they were required legally, some of which is pirated. And they cited them as one of their key sources of training data to access. And they actually thanked them in their paper. So that is the real, like this hypothetical of where are we accessing data? Where are we finding it? It's real. It's being accessed everywhere all the time. Being able to crawl and access data on the web is vital for the ability to train models at the scale that we need to. And so we sought to write this paper to put in perspective what we stand to lose. What's the potential if we do not have the ability to access data in America and train these models, how our models will atrophy or potentially not keep up with the cutting edge, and what that could mean for not only American, for culture, but also for economic security and for national security. And China is not the only other country in the world who's updating their laws. We've also seen places like Japan and Singapore, Israel, and even the EU have updated their kind of copyright and IP laws to give some space and allow for access to data for the purpose of training AI models. And, one of the things about America is that we want to build things here and we want to do, be the home of innovation and be the home of upstarts and new entrants. And if we don't have a regulatory environment that is welcoming to that kind of change and is allows for that kind of disruptive innovation, then we stand to lose out, and there's opportunity costs there. So that's just a little bit. I guess the last little thing would be, Tim mentioned there's a lot of court cases right now. There are, by my last count, I believe 39 open court cases within the United States filed against AI developers and companies who are helping to develop AI models. Based on the types of claims and stuff we're seeing there, how those cases could go, there's the potential that every leading model developer would be required to pay fines and or destroy their model if they were found to have found to have violated copyright law and the judge rules against them, which would put us at quite a disadvantage, I think, from a technological perspective.
Amazing. Thank you guys for that really robust introduction to fair use and AI and the global scene. I think a lot to cover, and we do not have time to get into all of everything that we would love to talk about here. So let's dive into, I think, what I think of as really like the meatiest pieces of this discussion, right? One of the things we talked about when we were prepping for this session was this idea of power dynamics and how the perception of the ways in which AI models have been trained is influencing the perceptions of corporate versus government versus individual power in society. And in particular, I think even those of us who come from the open community, right? We come from the sort of Creative Commons world of, free and open access to information will lead to democratization, right? That is the word that we use. But your paper points out that it could really go a different way, right? If China is the leader in this democracy is not going to be a value that is core embedded in the technologies that we see. And so fair use has this word fair in it. And I want to get into this question of fairness because I think that really touches upon how people are, especially creators, are feeling about AI and whether they want it at all, right? So I'd like to get into this question of fairness. What kinds of fairness does fair use actually care about as a legal doctrine? And what is sort of out of scope for fair use? So, Tim, maybe you could start there.
Yeah, for sure. Let me talk first a little bit about just kind of like what the law in the books is. Maybe that's like a good place to ground the conversation. And then I think more broadly, yeah, happy to give some reflections on like fairness, more broadly speaking, capital F fairness, if you will. Right now, the fair use doctrine is famously a painful doctrine to work through because effectively it is these kind of four vaguely defined factors. And the way courts deal with it is they say, well, look at all these factors and reach some kind of assessment on whether or not you think this is a fair use. And so some of these factors are very broad. It's like the nature and scope of the use, or that's like maybe one of the broadest ones. There's also more narrow ones, which is like, oh, does this use impact the market for the work that you're copying, right? But I think there's been a couple of things that are very core to fair use doctrine that have kind of been reaffirmed over and over and over again by courts, right? So the right to educate and the right to critique, right? These are kind of like big, like fair use, like very much within the square of fair use, right? So the idea here is, like I mentioned earlier, if I take someone's photo and I mess with it and republish it as a critique on their work, right? Fair use really defends that, right? It says, look, we don't really want to live in a world where copyright ends up becoming this kind of lever to shut down speech. And so one of the things we're going to carve out of copyright is the idea that like, oh, are you engaging in a kind of critique? Then yeah, that really is like a powerful lever and an argument in favor of fair use. The other one, which is where AI sits interestingly, is basically in the realm of technological innovation, right? So we will sometimes say, and one of the cases I'm always reminded of most is Google image search. So there's a famous lawsuit, basically, where Google's like, hey, we've got this entirely new technology we call Google image search. You're going to search for a word and it's going to show you a bunch of thumbnails of images that are related to your search term, right? And the immediate, I mean, if you're IP pilled, you're like an IP brain, you're like, oh my God, it's like a huge IP issue. And there was, in fact, an enormous lawsuit about whether or not you're allowed to take these thumbnails. And ultimately, where the court lands is to say, look, like the benefit of being able to have something like Google image search or image search in general, take the company out of it, is so great that we think that actually like this thumbnailing, even though it technically is a kind of infringement of your copyrights, we're going to allow, right? So technological advancement has been a feature of the fair use analysis. So that's kind of maybe some intuitions around the law and kind of the uses that fair use protects and maybe protects less. I think it is worth thinking more broadly though, right? There's a school of thinking about judicial decision-making, which is kind of a realist decision-making, which is like the judges make up their mind and then they come up with a rationale to figure that out. And there's a way of viewing these cases, which is just like, okay, there's some notion of fair that they are trying to get to when they make these decisions. And that's kind of what lies behind it all. And I'll just quickly say this and then stop rambling. I think that as a reflection of kind of the cohort of like young, sort of free culture, Creative Commons radicals in the 2000s, my community at least has become very divided with time, right? There's some people who said, look, we made a commitment to openness and IP, and I stand by that no matter what is the case, right? And that is the thing I'm protecting, is that I believe that fundamentally IP should be a much more open, loose concept. And I think there's some people who have switched their analysis, that they basically say, look, I know we supported that back then, but I don't agree with that anymore. And when I've talked to them, I think one of the things that kind of bugs them is that kind of in the old days, it really felt like the battle was, oh, well, we're going to go up against Disney, right? Like the big IP holder. Or, there's all these cases about Hollywood being the ones trying to set this down. And I think here in the IP case or in AI case, it's almost like that the downstream uses of AI have proven to be so uncomfortable for people that I think some people are reevaluating their kind of commitments. And I think reasonable minds can differ on this issue, but I think part of that has to do with how they see fairness, right? And whether or not the sort of change in the kind of like sort of constituencies implicated by the technology require you to change your positions around the openness of IP. So more to talk about there, but just to keep it short.
Thanks. Yeah. First of all, thank you for summarizing like 30 years of fair use law, right? Like in a very sort of short and elegant way. It's actually a lot that we're building on here. One of the things I always think about with fair use is the that it's an economic right. Like the way we conceive in the United States of what copyright is protecting really is this like economic right. We don't have moral rights in those same sorts of ways that other countries like Europe has moral rights. We don't really have that in the United States. And so the fairness question that copyright is really trying to get at has more to do with markets than it has to do with other things. And on that front, I'm curious whether, if we're thinking about copyright as a lever for regulating AI, I'm curious what you guys think. If imagine a world where, okay, we do require permission, right? And there's licensing markets that develop. How do you think that would change the direction of AI development? For example, would it stop automation from happening and putting people out of jobs? Or would it do something else to the market? I'm curious what you think, like in a no fair use world where everything has to be permission and licensed, what does that do to the development of AI?
Certainly, yeah. So it's super rich, and there's actually a specific piece that I'll bring Josh in here for. And I think I sort of like buy maybe what you're headed at with the question, right? Which is, okay, so imagine sort of the courts come out of these cases that are really going to get decisions in like the next 3 months. Like literally about to see how this thing turns out, where the courts say, look, we take a very strict view. If you're going to try to create or train an AI system and you're using data in doing that, like it's not a fair use. You need to seek permission from everybody. All right. The end result, right, is that AI developers, people who are trying to create new AI models, are in a kind of position where they have to say, look, who do I got to go get permission from? And who do I have to pay to make sure that they don't sue me, essentially? And given the sort of large amount of data that you need to create these AI models, part of the concern is that the main winners in that kind of ecosystem are folks with deep pockets, actually. Like if you can afford to pay for all the licensing of the data that you need to train a model, then in fact, like in order to kind of play the AI game, you really need kind of the cash in pocket in order to make this happen. So I think one of my concerns, you talk about fairness, right, is that I think like in restricting the fair use doctrine here, you give rise to an AI market which is very unequal, where you actually end up with a few players that are well capitalized that can pay for everything, and then no one else can get into the game. Like basically to just have table stakes, you need millions and millions of dollars.
I think that also potentially reflects the other side of the market, where it's going to be only the largest rights holders that can mass license lots of works
So
simultaneously.
yeah,
I'm not sure that individual creators will be well served in that world. I'm curious what you think about that.
yeah, I think that's right. And I think there are, again, like who knows, right? It's such a kind of like wild world to consider, like the kind of strict version of this. But I think that's generally right. Like I think unfortunately the hard facts of it are, if you were a company who's like, we've got $100 to spend on licensing, but I can't pay off everybody. I can't license from everybody. I have to basically put those dollars in a place that lowers the legal risk as much as is possible. That will tend to be to companies that have the biggest numbers of lawyers, which are, I think, like the very big rights holders, right? Your Hollywoods of the world and all that. I think one thing I do want to bring Josh in on, though, Lou, I think your question is very rich. I think in part because I think you're also pointing out what I think is another big legacy of copyright, which is that frequently the copyright gets kind of freighted with all these other objectives. And I think like classically, right, if people had images of themselves they don't like online, right, you actually don't file a content takedown, you file a copyright takedown. And the reason is because companies really care about copyright. They don't really care about like content as much from a content moderation standpoint. And that's a kind of place where like, okay, so suddenly this weird thing, which is like for like kind of protecting creative expression, is really actually being used to do like content takedown, tackling and blocking and tackling. And I think that's actually one point that I think is worth making is that basically there's a couple of areas where copyright plays into AI. We're specifically talking about training, right? Which is basically like, what do you need in order to build the AI in the first place? Look, the way I think about AI, it's almost like a piano. Like I can play a piano in a ways that is, it's just Hey Jude, right? I'm just like, and I think the same thing is true of AI too, right? Which is like, and this is often called inference or kind of like the outputs of the AI model. What Josh and I think would point out is basically that like, sure, there's lots of ways of violating copyright once you have the actual AI system. But the question is like whether or not you want to restrict even the creation of these systems in the first place. I think maybe the final thing, and I'll toss it over to Josh specifically for this because he's way smarter on this than I am, is, some people often say, oh, well, these systems are being used for impersonation, right? And I think, again, like, I think some people say, well, we should use copyright to try to take that down. But I think, Josh, you probably just talk a little bit about how, like, that discussion is evolving.
Yeah, I think I would echo a lot of those points from Tim. I think one thing also to clean up on here is if you want to have a robust, I think individualized, but also open source kind of future for AI, requiring training data and locking training data down, whether it's through compulsory licensing or whether it's through specific deals, that's going to be really difficult for individuals or for smaller, maybe more marginalized communities or folks who don't have access to that same amount of startup capital. You're just simply, I think, going to struggle. Thankfully, we have folks like the Authors Alliance and others who are building specifically public corpuses of data, and those are fantastic, and we should support those. But I think limiting those, and as I did earlier, there is other places in other countries, China being one of them, but other nations around the world are thinking about how do they create data pipelines and opportunities to access data for that pure training use. I think Tim made a really good distinction that we're talking about specifically the training side here. On the output side, I think this has been a larger conversation about what the change in AI means to the law. Where does AI, where does the law cover AI? And I think we've seen so far in courts, and I think we've honestly also seen this in Congress and also as well as technologists kind of saying that, fraud is still fraud. If I'm using an AI model to trick somebody or try to impersonate their grandmother to take money from them or to steal their bank information, I'm still committing fraud. And if I'm using one of these models to do something, commit an illegal act, if I'm using a model to specifically try to copy somebody's work and pass it off as my own, I think you can still bring a claim, and I think that's been seen and it's been upheld such, right? We've seen impersonation schemes, we've seen deep fakes, and the law is held up okay. And while there may be areas on the edges that we need to maybe trim and get a little bit more hard and fast, I think specifically one that I've personally worked on and support are places like, non-consensual intimate imagery. So we're talking about deepfake pornography of people or kind of images that are doctored to try to impersonate people, specifically children. Yeah, there should be no place for that. We should have laws that stop that. But again, I think that issue or the output side of the issue when we're talking about using AI models like on the outputs, that is very different than when we're talking about accessing data and using some of this information to train, because there are a expansive universe. Really, as Tim said, there are a lot of ways to play a piano. There are a lot of ways to play with an AI model. Just go online and see how there are so many wonderful communities all over the internet talking about how people are building and leveraging these tools to support themselves, their families, help them explore new intellectual or personal endeavors. And I think to me, that's really exciting as someone who cares a lot about innovation, about technological growth, and frankly, disruption. Competition is something that I think we all really value and something that has been a little bit of a uniting force here in DC recently. There's been a lot of crossover around people being concerned about how large certain technology companies are. There would be, frankly, in my opinion, something that would be a gift if you're someone who does not want to see robust kind of disruptive competition in the world, would be a required compulsory licensing to train AI models.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. One of the other, I think, issues in the mix around AI is this question that I think a lot of people have about how real is this as a technology, right? Like, on the one hand, there's a lot of marketing speak out there that is very easy to just be like, that sounds like a bunch of snake oil, all of these like VCs and people, like, they know how to talk in a way that really oversells the value of the thing that is being created. And your paper also talks a lot about the opportunity costs of, let's call it the AI that didn't happen, or the kinds of innovations that can come through AI technologies, right? So I would characterize your paper as on the optimistic end of whether you think AI is indeed such a transformative technology. So I'd like to give Josh in particular, and Tim as well, a moment to just talk a little bit about what you see as like the most realistic high value things that AI could achieve or has achieved. Maybe let's even talk about what we have achieved already, because when you're talking about like, here's what could happen, I think that can feel snake oily to people. And so I want to get into like, what are we actually seeing these technologies really outputting, and what is the value of that to society that we're weighing against, like when we're thinking about this copyright fair use balancing test and we're weighing things, right? Like, how are we thinking about those innovations in particular versus the sort of individual creative outputs of particular, authors, musicians, and others that are being mined, if you will, for this output?
Yeah, sure. I can start with a few. I'll let kind of Tim add in. You might have some ones that I'm going to forget. I think in terms of concrete benefits that we've seen from some of these models, I would point to advances in healthcare. There have been a number of papers published in Nature and in Science that highlight, drastically reduced development times for new therapeutics and new drugs, and as well as personalized medicine to help identify, we've been able to decode the human genome now, and the cost has continued to go down. Adding AI to that and adding additional technology to that can help people live longer lives and have faster and potentially cheaper medical alternatives. I would point, frankly, something our paper makes no secret about is the military implications of this technology. Firms like Palantir and others are using AI and ML models and kind of technology that was originally built out kind of in the private sector or out in the public, and that they're now able to integrate into their operations, which help speed intelligence operations. They're able to identify who is a bad guy versus who is a good guy and be as precise as possible when you're potentially administering lethal force. I think that's vitally important. I think there are areas such as traffic and smart cities, so optimizing traffic flows and finding ways so we can cut down on emissions and pollution, cut down on road deaths, which have been rising starkly since the pandemic, something that I think a lot of people can be affected. Anyone can be affected by. We're all either riding our bikes or walking on the street or driving in a car. We want to be as safe as possible when we're doing those things. So having ML models and AI people working in public and being able to translate some of these innovations that we're seeing at leading labs or in research opportunity at research organizations and putting those in the real world, I think are really important. I think maybe the last one would be education. That one, I think there's definitely the opportunity for some serious snake oily kind of like greasy hands salesman saying, I'm going to teach you to, you don't need to go to school anymore. No one's ever going to have to take a class again. I'm not going to buy that quite yet. I personally have used the tool myself to like buff up on some technical things. I've been in school for a few years. It's nice to be able to go back and revisit or learn new skills. I have younger siblings who are still in college and who've been able to find these tutors to be immensely useful to them, as well as, frankly, oftentimes a lot cheaper than having to go to a tutor. And I think that matters a lot when we're talking about leveraging the playing field and giving people the tools to succeed and be ready for the jobs of tomorrow. AI is going to play a part in that.
Yeah, I have maybe a slightly different take, though I agree with kind of what Josh said. And I think the things that I get very excited about with AI are this kind of like, it's like small AI. I think there's kind of a battle playing out right now on what AI is going to look like in the future. And I think on one end, there's the vision of this kind of monolithic system that's run by a company that is like this powerful computer that you have to like hook up an API to and get their product. On the other hand, there's also like all of these companies now working on this almost idea that you're going to just have a small GPU rig in your house and you're going to run your AI model locally, right? Even NVIDIA, the big kind of GPU company, announced that they were going to actually create like a little desktop GPU computer on their recent keynote. And I think those are the kind of areas where the kind of like real like magical kind of value of AI I've seen pop out, right? Like I have a friend who has customized and designed his own little AI assistant for his life. And it's exactly customized to his specific needs and his specific interests. I have another friend who's like a creative, he's like an author, right? And he's just basically like, yeah, I've been like working with this model to completely expand out this kind of like fantasy before bedtime story world for me and my kids. And it's really cool. They're just like nerdily fine tuning these models on their own. And I do think that, like, again, to go back to earlier, this is like the human side of what it means to have the copyright rules set in a certain way, right? Which is that basically, if really big companies are the ones that are going to basically be the ones who can afford and deploy this technology because of strict IP rules, it leads itself to a landscape that I think is like maybe very economically beneficial in the way that Josh is saying and that I believe. But I think we lose some of the kind of like really cool benefits that just come with like, it's like a piece of software on your computer that you can just play with and customize for exactly what you need it for. And I do really believe in like that kind of vision of AI. And if we can get there, part of that is like, can you train AI systems on your own at home? Can you fine tune them on your own? And I think a lot of that relies on a permissive IP environment. And for all those reasons, I think those are the kinds of uses that I think are both like economically, but also like spiritually, the kinds of things I'm really interested in defending.
I love that. And that sort of harkens back to that early 2000s, early web where everybody had their own blog and it felt more human and less big platform data surveillance. And so what's interesting about what you just said, Tim, is this idea that like, look, AI could be that too. It doesn't have to be, right? The internet that we have today is not inevitable. The big platforms, the big dominant players. I mean, let's be honest, some of them got there in part through fair use. And I think that's another thing that maybe feels a little icky to people, right? Is wow, Google really worked its way to market dominance. They're using its way along. And so, like, in some ways, there's this sense of like, ooh, maybe fair use is a little out of control. But is it fair use that's out of control? Or is there sort of a lack of regulation in other areas, say like antitrust or privacy, for example, that might play a counterweight such that we're not using fair use to effectuate some of these other regulatory and policy goals? Sorry, that was more of a comment than a question, I guess.
No, and I think it's actually, I mean, it's a good comment. And I think this is actually like, this is where I think there's like a lot of really interesting, reasonable minds can differ kind of debates to be had here, right? I think I just happen to believe, maybe this is just showing my bias, is just like the IP is just in everything. It's just like this very blunt instrument with which to kind of attack certain problems. And I think like, I just think that like the law offers other levers that are good here. But again, I think that that's actually a really interesting debate.
Great. Yeah. Right. All right. I'm just going to say for myself, thank you so much, Tim and Josh.
Thank you all. I really have enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you can join us at one of our upcoming events. Thanks all. Have a great day. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the future of knowledge. Be sure to follow the show. New episodes drop every other Wednesday with bold ideas, fresh insights, and the voices shaping tomorrow.